Welcome to the Arizona Author Series. This event was recorded on January 23, 2025. The Arizona Author Series is supported by the Arizona State Library Archives and Public Records, a division of the Secretary of State with federal funds from the Institute of Museum and Library Services. We are pleased to hear from Dr. Sunaura Taylor, author of the book Disabled Ecologies: Lessons from a Wounded Desert. Sunaura Taylor is an artist and writer. She is the author of Beasts of Burden, Animal and Disability Liberation, published by the New Press in 2017, which received the 2018 American Book Award. Taylor has written for a range of popular media outlets, and her artwork has been exhibited widely, both nationally and internationally. She works at the intersection of disability studies, environmental justice, multi-space studies, and art practice. She is an assistant professor in the Department of Environmental Science, Policy, and Management at the University of California, Berkeley. Her latest book is Disabled Ecologies: Lessons from a Wounded Desert, published by the University of California Press in 2024. She lives in the Bay Area with her daughter Leorna, her husband David, and their two cats, Rosie and Pirate. We are pleased to hear from Dr. Taylor and glad you can join us.
Hi, everyone. Can folks hear me okay? Okay, wonderful. Also, I wanted to see if it would be helpful for anyone if we could put on some captions, maybe. Actually, maybe we could just go ahead and do that just in case someone logs in who needs it. Ryan, I don't know if that's something you can do on your end or whether I should do it. But so my name is Sunaura Taylor. I'm so excited and happy to be here with you all. Of course, it's always a strange experience doing a book event over Zoom where I'm sort of sitting in my office alone with my computer, but I'm going to feel the energy from you all from wherever you all are at in Arizona or elsewhere. And I'm just really excited to also be participating in this particular book series. The Arizona library system was really central to this book project. The book I will be talking to you all about today shares the story of defense industry contamination that occurred in Tucson, Arizona from the 40s through the 70s. And so I spent quite a few years in Tucson researching this book and spent many, many hours in Tucson library archives. And so I'm very grateful to the library system. So I always begin my events, my talks with an access check. I am a disabled person. I work in critical disability studies. I'm a disability activist, but I'm also a disabled person. So if I was sharing physical space with you all, I would make sure that the space was accessible to all of you, that you all could hear me okay and everything. And so I'm going to do a similar thing here and just say that if there's any access needs, please type it in the chat and let us know. One of my access needs is that it can be difficult for me to pay attention to the chat at the same time, but it looks like we're in good hands with Ryan. Also, before I forget, I just want to thank Ryan and also Jan Levin so much for the putting this event together and for making it happen. So in terms of my own access needs, I use a power wheelchair and I don't actually use my arms very often. So you might see the top of my head quite a bit. And as I said, paying attention to the chat is a little bit difficult, but it looks like that's well attended. So I'm going to start by putting up a slideshow so that you're not only looking at me. And this is going to be a mix of images. It's going to be some photos from some historical archive images from the archive of the particular site that I'm talking about, these big black and white photos of lagoons filled with pollution. There's going to be photos of me at a Tucson water facility where water is being cleaned. Some other kinds of images of the site itself. And then there's quite a few paintings in there. And I want to say briefly that my background actually for many years was as an artist. I work still as an artist. There's always a sort of a dialogue between my visual work and my written work. And in this book, the pollution that I write about impacted groundwater. It impacted this Tucson's aquifer. And I, at first, when I started researching this, I didn't know very much about groundwater and aquifers and how they're kind of connected to the broader ecology. So one of the ways as a researcher that I use, one of the tools that I use to investigate is art practice. And so I made a series of drawings and paintings that kind of follow my changing ideas and understandings of what an aquifer is and how groundwater works. And you'll see that some of them are much more sort of imaginative and strange, and then some of them are more similar to sort of scientific illustrations, or what I imagine those to be. So just to kind of give you a background, some sense of what you're looking at while I'm reading. So give me 1 second while I just pull that up. Okay. Can everybody still see me and the images? I'm going to assume yes, okay. Wonderful. Okay, so I'm going to start with an opening reading. I will be kind of going back and forth between reading some sections of the book and then sort of just stopping and talking a bit and sharing about the book and my process. So this portion that I will start us off with is from the introduction. Environmental destruction is a story of disablement. While past environmental movements in the United States traditionally focused on the protection of landscapes understood as pristine, untouched, and wild, today those fighting for the environment work with an understanding that nature has been altered and damaged in profound and serious ways. What we live with in the present and will for decades to come, even under the best case scenarios, is mass ecological disablement of the more than human world. Arriving in Tucson in the summer of 2017 to research the pollution that I had long understood to have caused my own disability, I recognized intimately just how utterly entangled this mass disablement of nature is with the disablement of human beings. The pollution I came to the desert to be reunited with was born during Tucson's post-war boom, when various defense contractors and electronics manufacturers began disposing barrels full of toxic chemicals in open-air pits, that were dug straight into the desert ground of Tucson's south side. Lead among them was Hughes Aircraft Company, which began operations in 1951. Bought out by the defense giant Raytheon in 1997, Hughes Aircraft was a major player in Tucson's post-war era and a major polluter. Only a few dozen feet below Hughes headquarters lay the South Side's ancient aquifer system. thousands of years of geologic history composed of sediments and water were forever altered by the detritus of the war industry, including the chemical trichloroethylene, or TCE, an industrial solvent that would become synonymous with the pollution of the South Side. Once the ancient water body became polluted, so did the drinking water of those living above. I was drawn home to this long ago injured landscape and the powerful environmental justice movement that would emerge from it because they offer a vision of living with, a refusal to abandon those who have been harmed, and an insistence on staying with the trouble of a troubled landscape. Arriving back in Tucson, I found that the easiest way to begin to understand the South Side's contamination was to follow the trails of disability left in the pollution's wake. And very quickly, an expansive web of disability emerged. So there's some books that one just sort of always knows they're going to write. And for me, Disabled Ecologies is that book. And there's a variety of reasons for this. And I think the most obvious is that my own story, my own understanding of my embodiment is connected to this history, to this story that I tell. So I always wanted to return to this history and learn more about it. My family moved away when I was 6. So even though we followed the as best as we could, kind of what was going on in Tucson with the pollution and with the various lawsuits that followed the pollution, I really wasn't, I was a kid, but I also wasn't here, so I didn't really know on a sort of I didn't really know the whole story, right? So I knew that I always wanted to return and learn more. But honestly, none of that was why I sort of wanted to write this book. This book is really not a memoir. It's not a sort of personal investigation of my own story, but my own connection to this pollution and my own story is really inevitably sort of entangled with the story I tell, because ultimately, growing up with the understanding that my disability was caused from pollution led to 2 sort of obsessions of mine that would ultimately sort of become this book. And these obsessions are sort of disability and what disability is and what disability means. And the other is nature or environmentalism. What does it mean to take care of our environment, and what is nature? So as a child, I understood that disability was not an individual problem or a medical problem, right? I had a visceral understanding that disability was political, that disability could be caused by systems of harm, systems of exploitation, by harming nature, by environmental injustice, right? And I also understood that disability was something that could impact a whole community. Simultaneously, I also had an understanding that nature wasn't separate from us, right? Again, I had this sort of visceral embodied understanding that when we harm nature, when we pollute our water, when we pollute our air, that is ultimately harming ourselves, right? That our own health and the health of our environments are utterly inseparable. And these 2 understandings of nature and disability really have stayed with me throughout my whole sort of research life, theoretical career, my artistic career. They are kind of driving subjects that continuously reoccur in my work. So when I finished my first book that was really looking at the relationship between disability and non-human animals, and I knew that I really wanted to look at environmental issues more broadly, it was these 2 ideas, right, that the health of nature and the health of human beings are so inseparable, and that disability is political, and that disability is entangled with environmental harm that I knew that I wanted to write about. And at a certain point, I knew that to write this book, I would need to root it in the same place where these ideas had formulated. And I'm so glad that I had that sort of epiphany to go back to Tucson and to research this history, because it was actually just such an incredible gift to learn more about what actually happened and the incredible environmental justice movement that formed in response to this pollution. So this book, Disabled Ecologies, Lessons from a Wounded Desert, really ends up doing two things. One is that it exposes this necessity, I think, of thinking about the health of nature and the health of human beings together, right? And this has always been the case, but I think particularly in this moment of climate crisis, of extinction crisis, of these, very visible and extreme, extreme weather, natural, these disasters happening around us, where we see so viscerally the entanglement between the health of people and the health of land. And so partially what I want to do in this book is to give us a language for talking about these issues as not separate, right? We don't have just public health on one side for people, and then environmentalism and environmental remediation on the other side. That we really need to see these issues as entangled. But the other thing that this book really does is that it tells the story of what happened in Tucson. And particularly since I am talking to the Arizona library system, I'm really excited to also just spend some time really thinking about this history and what's so important about remembering this history. So I kind of want to give a quick overview, a broad overview of this story. So from the 1940s through 1970s, Hughes Aircraft Company, which actually, as I said in the portion that I read, became Raytheon, but actually just as the book was published, became RTX. And various other weapons manufacturing industries kind of came to Tucson and pretty much immediately started dumping their chemical waste into the desert. And there's all sorts of reasons, historical reasons, why we could look at as to why this happened. But whatever those reasons are, they dumped their waste in these huge lagoons. I'm realizing that my slides are not moving, so I'm going to have to do it manually. But also along desert washes, in abandoned wells, in along fences, down drains. And these chemicals, of course, ultimately seeped into the desert floor and into the groundwater. Now, at the time, Tucson only source of water before the Colorado River Project water came through was the groundwater. So these industries contaminated Tucson's only source of water. Now, the community that was harmed by this was the community that was largely living above the contaminated area, the south side of Tucson, which slowly over those decades became a predominantly a largely Mexican American community. And we can look at the various reasons again why that sort of shift in demographic happened, but partially it was in part due to sort of racist gentrification plans that had taken place in other portions of Tucson that pushed Mexican-American community members into the south side of Tucson, where, unbeknownst to them, there was this contaminated water. So in the very late 1970s, early 1980s, the pollution started to come to light, but nothing really was publicly done about it for any sort of public health concerns. But the community themselves realized that something was happening. People were getting sick, people were dying, people were getting various forms of cancers and other kinds of rare and serious illnesses, babies born with congenital disabilities, and so forth. So obviously the community members knew that there was something wrong, and they started organizing. In 1985, there was a really incredible local journalist with the Arizona Daily Star named Jane Kay, who started investigating. She had done some research already. She was an environmental journalist, had done some research already into Hughes and these other industries. And so together, between her and the community, the story came to light in this series of amazing articles that came out in 1985 that were really explosive and really kind of showed the extent of the harm done. Jane Kay basically, with the help of community members, essentially did her own health study, did all of this investigation into where the contamination had gone. And ultimately, we don't know exactly how many people would have been impacted by this pollution, because the records were just not kept well and studies were not done in time. But it's very, very possible that it was, tens of thousands of people who could have come into contact with that water. But one of the things that was really amazing was that within a few months, the community organized, and they organized into a really formidable group called Tucsonans for a Clean Environment. And this was something that when I first came to Tucson that I really didn't know. I didn't know that Tucson was actually home of one of the earliest environmental justice movements that had formed in this country. The sort of originary environmental justice movements, as we sort of understand them, it formed in the mid-1980s in North Carolina. But simultaneously, there was this amazing group in Tucson that was forming at the same time. So they didn't even really have the language of environmental racism, of environmental justice yet in those early years to describe what was happening. But they kind of formulated these kinds of ways of thinking about what happened on their own. So this book is asking these sort of broader sort of philosophical questions about the relationship between the health of our own bodies and the health of non-human bodies. But this book is also really trying to tell this story and uplift this amazing history, because I think often in Tucson, at least, there's a memory of the contamination. People know the story of TCE. People have loved ones who've been impacted, but there's less memory of the incredible and really successful organizing that this community did. They won a historic lawsuit. They ended up getting actually some health, a portion of a health clinic set up for those who had been harmed. They fought for sort of state-of-the-art water facilities, which in communities that are impacted by environmental racism is often not the case. All of these wins, right? And yet, of course, justice is justice is not just a series of wins. And so there's still a lot of struggle, and people are still dealing with the ramifications of this pollution. So I want to read another section that talks a little bit more about this story. I think actually the one other thing that I want to say that I didn't mention is that not only did this community have to fight against these industries that had polluted their water, right? But they also had to respond to this incredibly racist gaslighting of city officials who essentially blamed their own illnesses on the community themselves, saying that that the community was predisposed to illness, that they were becoming sick because of diet and lifestyle. These ways of exploiting the shame and guilt that can often emerge from illness and disability, right? This question of like, well, did I do something wrong? Exploiting those feelings to deflect blame away from the city and away from the industries that had done the harm, right? And placing that blame back on the community itself. Thankfully, this community did not these sorts of accusations just made them stronger, and actually they really used their experiences of illness and disability to not only expose that it was that these industries were to blame, but also to really expose the racism in the city system at that time. So I'm going to read another portion that talks more specifically about some of this history. Well, the EPA and the industries responsible for site remediation limited their concerns to a definition of nature that did not include human bodies. Southsiders would push for a far more expansive notion of care and remediation. For 3 decades, ill and disabled Southsiders would articulate a vision of justice that would include treatment for both landscapes and people, and that acknowledges long histories and potential futures of injury. Within less than 2 months of forming, Tucsonans for a Clean Environment was calling for an epidemiological study of the impacted area, establishment of an Arizona registry for cancer and birth defects, compensation for injuries, cleanup of the groundwater, greater groundwater protection laws, persecution of the polluters, and the firing of city officials who, they argued, had treated the community with gross negligence due to racial and class prejudice. They also organized and won historic water contamination lawsuits against Hughes in the city. Realizing the inadequacies of even a successful lawsuit, Southsiders would also push the Arizona Senate to fund a community health clinic focused on TCE-related concerns. This story is, in some ways, a hope-inspiring success story. In real and lasting ways, community organizers made their vision of justice for both people and the aquifer real. They won hard-fought battles for epidemiological studies and for a say in Superfund remediation process and the treatment the aquifer and impacted ecosystems would receive, and for a health clinic that offered, and in fact should still be offering, a variety of free services to those impacted by the contamination. In the process, they also brought a conversation about racism into the public spotlight and came to know their own power as a community. Their organizing also had profound ripple effects, helping to establish 2 of Arizona's central environmental agencies, the Arizona Department of Environmental Quality and the Pima County Department of Environmental Quality. The Southside's toxic plume is emblematic of countless environments that have been irreparably damaged and that now exists in a perpetual state of toxicity and impairment. To some degree, the area has been so compelling to me because it is so typical, which also, I believe, makes the story worth following and investigating even more deeply. The fact that the specific events I've just recounted follow a familiar trajectory, one similar to other narratives of environmental justice organizing, allows us to ask a series of important questions. Why are these stories so common? What constitutes an end to such stories? And more vitally, what constitutes a successful outcome? Environmental justice narratives are often truncated at the point at which a community secures litigation, studies, or remediation. But what happens next? How do people and landscapes continue living with illness and disability long after these battles have been fought? Struggles around access to healthcare and support services often continue for decades, long after journalists and lawyers leave a community. While health is a frequent instigator of environmental justice organizing, it is so often a significant issue that remains unaddressed in people's lives, even in success stories like that of Tucson's South Side. The South Side's poisoned aquifer similarly embodies the uncomfortable reality that treating environmental harm is a long-term, enduring, and at times incurable task. The story of the South Side's aquifer is a reminder that for many ecosystems, the coming decades will stretch not just towards death or health, but towards something different, something impaired, precarious, dependent, filled with loss and struggle, requiring assistance, accommodation, and creative forms of care. As a disabled person, I recognize this as disability. So when I arrived back in Tucson to really begin to research this project, like many researchers, like many people who go back to better understand a story, I was really overwhelmed by where to start. I spent a lot of time in the Valencia Library in a EPA-run archive that they have of this particular pollution. And there were just binders and binders full of information. And so where to start? But for me, as a disability studies scholar, I found that really the easiest way for me to begin to understand what had happened was to follow the trails of injury and disability. And so I mean this quite literally, that my method for this book was really to follow these trails of injury that the pollution left in its wake. And this sort of expansive web of injury, of disability that emerged is really what I mean by by the term disabled ecologies. And so in some ways, disabled ecologies as a concept is a sort of a way of mapping. And a way of mapping injury that is mapping both material injury, right? This contamination moved into the bodies of human beings and impacted their health. It moved into the bodies of those the human beings, pets, their farmed animals. Many of the stories that people told about, starting to realize that there was something wrong often began with people's pets or their farmed animals becoming sick. There's the contamination came into contact with wildlife decades before the city would actually get involved in doing anything about this contamination. We know that the Tohono O'odham Nation sent letters stating that the pollution from Hughes facilities was moving through the desert washes and onto their land, and that the cattle and animals were drinking this and dying. And they warned decades before that this contamination would ultimately move into the aquifer and impact the human and broader ecosystem of the area. So there's these very material trails of injury. We could also look at the injury to the aquifer itself. This aquifer, this groundwater, is going to be essentially in need of perpetual remediation. There's, a tremendous amount of contamination has been removed. There, unfortunately, are still new contaminants are being found in the water. And also contaminants are just hard to remove all the way. One of the things about an aquifer that's so interesting, right, is that there's all these different layers of material. There's that the water moves through rock, through sand, but also through but there's also dense kind of clay areas underground. And these areas, the contaminants have really gotten stuck in, and they're hard to remove from. So the aquifer itself is permanently altered, right? Permanently injured in some ways. The trees, one of the first things that alerted people to there being a problem was that the trees were dying around where the contaminants were being dumped. So there's these very material ways that we can trace the impacts of these contaminants on human bodies, on human communities, but also on our broader ecosystem and on our fellow creatures, right? But then there's also, I'm a disability studies scholar, so I'm interested in disability not only as a sort of a lived reality, but also as a concept. Disability is like gender and race, a concept that shapes the world in profound ways. And it's a concept that can be used and is used in different ways. And so I was also interested in how disability and related concepts, health, illness, how these concepts kind of where they are in the stories that were told around this site. And really they were everywhere, right? We can see in the example that I already shared of the city officials sort of blaming the community themselves for their own health issues, right? That's a place where disability was sort of, and the stigma of disability was sort of used for certain kinds of political ends. We can then look at how the community fought back against that and used their experiences of disability and illness actually as proof of not only of this harm, but also of racism and sort of abandonment from the city officials that should be looking out for them, right? But there was other ways. We could look at how narratives of disability were used by both sides of the litigation, how it came up in the public health studies, how disability and illness are told and talked about in the articles about the story. So sort of tracing all these different ways that disability is sort of already a really central part of the way that we tell environmental stories, even if it's sort of often unmarked or depoliticized. So let me just see where I'm at here. But so one of the questions that I had too is, how far can you follow a disabled ecology? Right? And when does a disabled ecology start? When does it end? People are still, 40 years post this contamination coming to light, still dealing with health impacts from this contamination. As I mentioned, there's still contaminants that are emerging. I will say that no one on the South Side has drank that water since the early 80s when the wells were shut down. But there's still these psychological and physical ramifications, and then also continuing to be ramifications on the environment itself. But there's also a question of how, when a story starts, right? A lot of the city officials and people I would talk to would start the story as I have here, starting it in the 1940s when these industries moved in. But a lot of community members would tell a much longer story of colonial dispossession, of racism in the Southwest. But then there's also a sort of geographical expansiveness, you know, essentially how far can we follow these trails? And this is a particularly interesting question when you are thinking about or looking at a weapons manufacturing industry, which is essentially an industry that is built for disablement and injury. And so I want to read another excerpt that actually kind of asks this question of how far you can follow a disabled ecology. And this is actually from the conclusion of the book. In September 2016, a community of poor rural farmers in Yemen was working together to dig a communal well. Living in a war zone, the farmers had little access to water sources, but they knew if they could tap into the aquifer, they would have enough to sustain themselves, their families, their neighbors, and their fields. They pooled their resources and began to dig. On the day their drill hit water, a cluster of bombs was dropped from overhead, killing 31 of them. These bombs were built on Tucson's south side, at Raytheon, in what was originally simply known as Air Force 44, the same patch of desert that had been occupied by Hughes and the TCE lagoons. How far can you follow a disabled ecology? The trails of injury and resistance flow outward across bodies and species, cities, and borders. I find myself returning to the hydrological systems known as aquifers. An aquifer can be understood individually or as multiple. Is it aquifer or aquifers? We can understand an aquifer in isolation as part of a broader water system, as a vast network of watersheds, or as a web connecting the deep earth, the mountains, the rivers, and the rain to our bodies and the bodies of our fellow life forms. An aquifer mixes up time. Water, thousands of years old, mingles and becomes inseparable from that which has just come to earth. An aquifer reaches into the future, containing the paths and connections that will allow future water to reach the rivers and washes and riparian ecosystems awaiting its arrival. An aquifer is a good metaphor for a disabled ecology. Howard Hughes chose Tucson as a location for his aircraft company because military industry advisors agreed that it would be less of a target for perceived threats from across the Pacific Ocean than his company's home in Culver City, California. Yet Hughes also picked Tucson for his aircraft company for more personal reasons. He perceived it as being clean and germ-free. But of course, Hughes Aircraft Company would be anything but clean. Within a few short months of Hughes opening, employees directed to do so by their managers and supervisors would spill their used chemicals down drains, along fences, and washes on the desert ground. As Giovanna Gitiro writes, for Hughes, the intermittent stream beds of the Ponta Cana Wash, Julian Wash, El Rio Wash, and Rialto Creek became not sensitive vital ecosystems, but convenient dumping grounds. These employees would build the world's first air-to-air guided missile, the Falcon, and later would manufacture a broad array of targeting devices, radars, and missiles, the Phoenix, Mavericks, and TOWs, devices for bombing people or to assist with bombing people. In 1985, the year Kay's newspaper articles were published, Hughes' budget from the Pentagon for missiles was just under $2 billion. Of course, these missiles would not stay grounded in Tucson. What sort of disabled ecologies did these missiles create as they landed on another nation's soil during the Korean War? What trails of injury, death, and resistance were put into motion as each Tucson-made missile landed in someone else's faraway watershed? and still lands, as of course they are still sending bombs all over. In an essay on water, TCE, and the loss of her beloved husband, Fernando, to liver cancer, writer Beth Alvarado describes her thoughts as a child growing up in Arizona during the Cold War. If they drop a bomb, I thought, the electricity would disappear and the pumps would stop pumping, and suddenly we'd all be out of water. They warned us in school that Tucson was, after all, a town ringed by missiles, number 10 on the list of the top targets of our enemies. Alvarado's childhood anxiety was not too far off base. Tucson's water was made undrinkable because bombs were dropped. These bombs were just not dropped on Tucson. I'm going to check to see how I'm doing on time. Okay. So one of the I talked in the beginning about there being certain concepts, disability in nature, that I've been, and ways of thinking about those concepts that have always stayed with me. And I think another sort of idea or question or concept that has really been an obsession of mine throughout my work is what I kind of have come to see as the paradox of disability. I, again, from an early age, had an understanding that disability can be caused by systems of extreme harm, right? By the worst of what people can do to each other and to our planet, right? Through war, through exploitation, through extraction, through all sorts of different kinds of harms and violences. But I also, as a person who's come to really understand in disability in different ways, who've been really active in disability community, and who's thought a lot about disability as a concept and as a lived reality, that disability also is a experience and an idea that can also hold other ways of being, other kinds of possibilities, other kinds of values is the word that I'm looking for. Values of interdependence, excuse me, of vulnerability, of care, right? And that these values that kind of come from the experience of acknowledging that we live in vulnerable bodies, and that disability is sort of an inevitable part of a lived reality of having a body, that disability actually is a space that can also offer these potentially more compassionate and I think also generative values. And so I see that as a paradox, and I really saw that in this story of this incredible movement, right? The sort of forms of justice, the values that these organizers were fighting for, that stemmed from the experience of being disabled and ill people, but then also that we're struggling against these systems of harm that perpetuate disablement and injury, right? So I want to read one final section that I hope kind of gets to actually the sort of some of the sort of political thrust, I think, behind some of these ideas. So disability is not inherently injustice, though it is certainly far too often birthed from it. Disability can indeed be resistance to the very systems that produce it. This book is about resisting the mass disablement wrought by violence and exploitation while learning to live and thrive in the disability already here and the disability that will always be yet to come. Recognizing the potential of disability while resisting the oppressive forces that produce so much of it moves us away from a politics of eugenics and abandonment, ableist ecological responses to environmental crises, toward a disability politics of living with. There is, as legendary disability activist Harriet McBride Johnson described it, the undeniable reality of disabled lives well lived. People take conditions most would not choose and make vibrant lives out of them. These disabled lives well lived are what we can hope for our permanently altered ecosystems, for our water, our air, our atmosphere, and our communities. And I will leave it there so that we have a few minutes for questions. And my apologies, I realized that my slideshow for some reason did not automatically go. But I'm happy if it comes up to share some of the aquifers. Thank you all so much.
Awesome, thank you. So I see a couple people with hands up. I'll address those, and I see something in the Q&A, so I'll kind of monitor where these where are going. So I just want to double check. I've got Andrea Michaels who's got a hand raised. Andrea, do you have a question you want to ask either here in the chat or either through just talking through the mic?
Yes, I would like to ask, or first, my compliments and appreciation for this wonderful work. I see it as so important and wonder if Sunaura is also working or communicating with the people who are objecting to the pinyon plain mind, particularly as we look at what the potential impact is on the aquifer by the mine.
Yeah, thank you so much for your question. So, one of the things that has been really telling about going across the country and sharing this book with different communities over the past year, or not quite a year since the book came out, is that everywhere I go, people say, "Oh, this is so much like what is happening here in Baltimore or here in Athens, Georgia, or here in Brooklyn," right? There's this, and even in Tucson itself, there's so many environmental issues, right? There's so many industries. There's so mining industries, weapons manufacturing industries. There's so much that I made a decision pretty early on with this project that because I was already kind of creating this method where I was looking so expansively, that I would quickly get really, really overwhelmed if I tried to start also really understanding the dynamics of other kinds of stories that were happening in terms of other industries that were polluting. So, no, I haven't specifically researched that that particular mining industry, but I think what is so powerful and really disturbing, honestly, is how similar the trajectories of these kinds of things are, and that even after decades and decades of experience, we are still doing, extracting more and more, and dumping more and more contaminants, and that we haven't really, on a industry and government level, have not learned our lessons from these sorts of stories and from the amazing organizing that took place. Yeah, I think that's what I'll share for now about that.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
We've got another hand raised. I hope I'm pronouncing it right. Chimene or Chimene, Chimene. Go ahead. If you've got a question, go for it.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah. Hi.
This is Men, and no worries about the pronunciation. It's a lifelong problem. Sunaura, I would like to thank you from the bottom of my heart for your advocacy and for your work here today. I just wanted to let you know that there are a few things I got in my notes disability is political and entangled with ecological harm. It almost makes me verklempt when I'm reading it out loud because it touches me that deeply that you shared that. Also, the exploitation of shame and guilt of victims and the blaming of the community for the ill effects to their health. The narratives of disability being a central part of how we tell political stories. Also, the quote from, I believe you said Beth Alvarado, an author who lived through the Cold War, who said that they were also damaged by the bombs, but that they didn't get dropped on Tucson. Oh my gosh. Thank you so much. I can't tell you how happy I am that I attended this meeting. I live in San Manuel. I moved here on January 25th last year because my sister bought me a house to keep me from being homeless. I am one of these people that has been damaged by my resistance. I've been disabled by damage. Oh my gosh, I'm trying to quote you and it's so emotional. I can't even.
No worries.
I have been disabled by my resistance to the oppression and violence of the systems of capitalism and patriarchy and white supremacy in our nation. And I am literally physically disabled. And it's an invisible disability because it's based on trauma, and people don't understand mental trauma and how it affects the body. So I live in San Manuel, which is a town that was built by Del Webb, his first master plan community, specifically for the employees of the Magma Copper Mine, which at the time was the largest underground mine for copper in the world. It has since been shut down and sold to BHP, but the citizens of San Manuel, I compare them to Stockholm Syndrome victims. They've literally become identified with their abuser, and they are waiting for the mining company to come back and bring the prosperity that they remember from the good old days of Magma Copper. And I'm a new resident, and I'm fighting to preserve the Galliero mountain range, and I don't want Faraday Copper to come in here and make an open pit mine all the way up to Miami. So I thank you so much for your work. I am fighting for Mother Earth till the day I die. I hope that their poisons don't kill me. Thank you, thank you, thank you so much.
Oh, thank you so much for sharing that. I'm so grateful for you just being, for sharing and being so vulnerable here, and also for your political advocacy. We need more people doing that political advocacy for ourselves, for our planet. And I think what you said about also just that, we're also, communities become so dependent on their oppressors, right? And because our employment gets so entangled with these industries, right? And lack of financial security of itself is, of course, a disabling experience. So there's so much that's wrong with how these industries get away with what they get away with. And I just really appreciate you sharing that and thinking about it in that way, and for your work. I think we might have time for one more. I'm not sure what time it is, but we might not.
Yeah, that's all right. I think we do. We've got one question in the chat. It's the only other one I see. So I think we got time. Will the underground toxins ever be neutralized by nature? If so, how long might that take?
Well, unfortunately, so what's happened in Tucson is that, one of the things about this contaminant or this site is that for a long time we were talking about it pretty much in relationship to only one contaminant, trichloroethylene, TCE. But it actually was pretty much a toxic soup. And, TCE was used to essentially like melt plastics off of electronics and aircraft. And so more as our ability to test for chemicals has gotten better. And also, as EPA regulations have kind of caught up with science, there are more contaminants of concern. And so then these remediation facilities have to take on the extra burden of then being designed to clean other contaminants, right? Because there's not just like one, it's not like you build a remediation facility and it'll just clean up all the different contaminants. You have to target each contaminant, each chemical. So the long answer to that is that, you know, Earth time is a very, very long time. So I'm not gonna say that no, there will never be a time when it's transformed, but certainly not in my lifetime. You know, those contaminants are going to be there for a very, very, very long time. And in fact, if anything, we are just finding out that there's more of them. And so then the question becomes, how do we treat them? How do we clean them? What do we do with this water in the meantime? How do we stop the contaminants from moving? You know, it becomes a situation of trying to stop the harm from getting worse. Before we end, I do want to share that 2025 is the 40th anniversary of Tucsonans for a Clean Environment. And I have an amazing collaborator, Alicia Vasquez, who is a co-director of the Mexican American Heritage and History Museum in Tucson, Arizona. And she and I and a variety of other collaborators, community members, community partners have been organizing a series of events for 2025 that's going to be really celebrating and honoring this incredible movement, and also just a time of remembering. So I would love for folks to just be on the lookout for event notifications. There's going to be a series of art workshops and history exhibits at the throughout the Tucson library system, and also an art exhibit that will open up in September of 2025 at the Tucson Museum of Contemporary Art, and then a sort of a closing ceremony, rally, and opening of a permanent sort of artwork memorial piece that will happen in December. So if you are interested in this history or just in environmental justice in this region, I would love for you to just be on the lookout for more information about those events.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And to everyone, thank you to Dr. Taylor for her time in presenting for us. Thank you to everybody for joining. There is going to be a link in the chat. It is a link to a survey for this presentation. So feel free to fill that out for us. That helps us gauge interest for future presentations like this for the author series. The recording of this presentation will be made available on our YouTube channel. So if you just go to YouTube, State of Arizona Research Library, that'll be uploaded as soon as it's available, and share that link. You'll not only find today's presentation, but also past recordings of other author series talks. And with that, I hope to see you at other future events. Maybe even visit us in our reading room, because we have a lot of physical stuff and other stuff going on. So thanks to everyone. I will end the recording, and everyone have a great day. Thanks so much.
Thank you all so much. I really appreciate it.